The title of this talk is Journeying from the Apparent to Absolute Existence in Ibn Sab'in. Then I will divide this talk in three sections. In the first one, I shall introduce the doctrine of absolute existence and the first people who introduced it in Al-Andalus, in Spain. Then a section focused in Ibn Sab'in, who is quite important within these people because we still have several works preserved up to the present date that he wrote. And then finally a brief section on an unpublished work I'm working on right now with the help of Pablo and in Granada. To begin with, the first character, the person who is usually quoted as the introducer of this doctrine in the Islamic West is called Ash-Shawdi. His full name is Abu Abdullah Ash-Shawdi al-Halawi. He was a judge, an Islamic judge and a jurist, and he lived in Al-Andalus and North Africa during the 12th century. According to Louis Massignon, Ash-Shawdi developed a doctrine inspired in some aspects of Sufism as seen in Al-Hallaj, and he also encouraged, as the classical sources reflected, his disciples to engage in politics. However, other thinkers who were more literal in their reading of the religious message criticized him heavily because of his defense of the doctrine of absolute existence, al-wahda al-mutlaqa, and also because of his claim that the religious sciences were inaccurate in themselves. So, what was this doctrine about exactly? Al-wahda al-mutlaqa, absolute existence. There was a famous scholar who was born in Granada in the 14th century called Ibn al-Khatib, and he said the following when criticizing it. It's just, I find it funny to read it today because it pretty much looks to me as if he was actually praising it. But that's just the change of focus, I guess, 6 centuries after it. So he said, the Creator is the union of all that is apparent and all that is hidden, and there is nothing other than Him. The essence of everything is God, and the multiplicity of things in time and space, what is hidden and what is apparent, pain and pleasure, existence and non-existence happen only in imagination. Out of such illusion happening in our mind, all is one, and that one is the truth. Each servant is made of truth and falsehood, and if falsehood is removed, what remains is truth, which is God. Ibn al-Khatib exemplifies this position with the expression of Ibn Ahla, who we shall afterwards speak about, who said, the servant is truth with some attributes of falsehood. So, the character we mentioned at the beginning, Ash-Shawdi, he had a number of followers that spread his doctrines and practices over the following years, both in Al-Andalus and North Africa and even in the East. Ibn al-Mar'a was one of them. He was a jurist, also a Maliki jurist, and according to the biographical sources, he learned both dogmatic theology and the doctrine of absolute existence from Ash-Shawdi, who would have secretly initiated him. Ibn al-Mar'a had a great and long success among common people, both in Malaga and Murcia, where he settled on later on. He didn't look after popularity, but he was close to people and was sympathetic with them in relation to their concerns. He knew how to talk to people with understandable comparisons. Some characterized him with a cunning and joking spirit. Because of this, he was harshly criticized by advocates of the literalism of religious law, which was a general trend among the followers of the unity of existence, as we shall see. Followers of absolute existence were accused of believing in the presence of God Almighty in beautiful forms, as well as being bad philosophers because of contradicting God and His prophets. They were also accused of defending the eternity of the world, denying resurrection, and pretending they were intimates of God, awliya. They were accused as well of being Christians hidden in Islam and of being innovative. Nevertheless, there were also those who argued that such accusations came from not understanding the true meaning of the doctrine of absolute unity which would not pretend to break the religious law head-on, but to transcend and realize its ultimate purpose, which would be the union in God. It's pretty interesting that Ibn al-Khatib, who we mentioned earlier, the famous scholar from Granada, he explicitly cited that this doctrine had many followers in the region of Murcia, especially in the valley of Ricote, which is in northwest of this city, and which is the birthplace of Ibn Sab'in. Then, the next character we are going to mention is Ibn Ahla of Lorca, the place you're visiting tomorrow. This character is a clear example of the teaching attributed to Ash-Shawdi, encouraging his disciples to participate in political matters. After receiving his basic training in Islamic sciences from at least 3 teachers, this man was put in prison in Murcia. Subsequently, he was freed and he settled in his hometown, Lorca, where he became strong and started developing his project between the political and the theological. Biographical sources say that he became the ruler of the population. From here, it is said of him that, on the one hand, he chased those who opposed his doctrine. For this reason, it is said that many people pretended to follow his ideas to keep their properties and status. On the other hand, it is said that he behaved as a virtuous ruler and he was able to maintain and improve the situation of the inhabitants of Lorca. He remained there, in fact, as the ruler until his death in 1247. The sources have preserved some short verses of poetry that capture his thought in relation to absolute existence, like this short one. How much I suffer fiction that something is taking me away from you, dividing in me what is indivisible in itself. Then I'd like to... Yes. Yeah. So he said, how much I suffer fiction, wahm, that something is taking me away from you, dividing in me what is indivisible in itself. Then I'd like to briefly focus in Ibn Sab'in, who, among the followers of absolute existence, is especially relevant for us, since several of his works have been preserved up to the present day. And like the works of his predecessors and masters who we have mentioned, he called himself by this name. Ibn Sab'in means the son of 70, as well as Ibn Dara, which means the son of the circle. Both names have a connection with each other and with his beliefs, because number 70 was written at the time using a circle in a certain set of figures, and he also used to represent existence as a circle in which the outside of the circle represented absolute existence, and the inside of the circle represented the apparent forms of limited or controlled existence, with no real distinction between the two modes of existence, since their essence is the same. Ibn Sab'in traveled extensively since his departure from Murcia, after the death of the ruler Ibn Hud in 1237. He briefly stayed in Granada and then settled in Ceuta in North Africa. He married a wealthy woman there, allowing him to create a zawiya where his followers could gather. We should highlight the fact that he exercised teaching at such a young age. He was under 30. During these years, he wrote his 2 most famous philosophical works, The Sicilian Questions and al-Arif, which is translated as the prerequisite of the Gnostic. The first one, the Sicilian Questions, are a series of philosophical questions supposedly sent by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, although the historical circumstances of the text are not clear, and it could actually be a guidebook for beginners in philosophy. The issues treated match some of the most urgent problems in this time: the eternity of the world, the divine science, the categories, and the immortality of the soul. The second philosophical work is al-Arif, the prerequisite of the Gnostic, and here Ibn Sab'in develops the concept of the genuine Gnostic. The foundation is, of course, the concept of absolute existence. The Gnostics combine and exceed the perfections of the jurist, the theologian, the philosopher and the Sufi. They have their own special knowledge, which is true gnosis, which is the gateway to the Prophet from whom everything derives. Ibn Sab'in is known for a certain lack of accuracy in his use of philosophy, both in his use of arguments and in the exactitude of his terminology. It seems, in fact, that he considered philosophy an auxiliary discipline, always subordinate to the divine truth, which is absolute, which means it has no names or attributes. It's also likely that this conception of philosophy is connected with the criticism that he performed on other thinkers and mystics. Ibn Sab'in claimed that they didn't emphasize enough the unity that underlies the principle of absolute existence or unity of existence. Because if this principle is understood as he thinks it should, then divisions and distinctions that are customarily made can only be understood as signs of a larger, fully unified reality. It's also necessary to note that Ibn Sab'in was not an elite philosopher, as this was probably not his intention. We can perceive here a continuity with the teachings of Ash-Shawdi, who encouraged his disciples to meet common people and respond to their concerns. Ibn Sab'in was very popular among common people, as well as he used to participate in political issues, which was most likely the cause, along with his challenging thought and personality, for the persecutions he suffered in numerous places along his journey. Ibn Sab'in was in fact banished from Ceuta shortly after completing the prerequisite of the Gnostic. Between his departure from Ceuta and his arrival in Mecca, Ibn Sab'in stayed for short periods of time in various places, like Badis or Bijaya in modern Algeria, in Tunisia, or in Egypt. Once living in Mecca, Ibn Sab'in continued to participate in political issues, leading him to be a prominent figure among North African residents in the city. He earned the trust of the local ruler, Abu Numay, and composed in his name a letter of recognition for the Hafsid ruler of Tunis, al-Mustansir Billah, in 1253. There are several anecdotes that testify his peculiar behavior and the critical view that has been generally taken on him. As an example, it is told that he retired to a cave, waiting for revelation as the Prophet did, but philosophically, as an emanation into intellect. Then the different versions of his death follow the same pattern, as the biographical sources are divided between those who say that he committed suicide by cutting his veins, and those who report that he was poisoned by the king of Yemen, al-Mudaffar, who hated him for unknown reasons. During his years traveling through North Africa and living in Mecca, he wrote numerous letters and works of mystical content, as well as he approached the science of the letters through the interpretation of hidden meanings in the letters of the Arabic alphabet. According to some newly found manuscripts attributed to him, he may have also had some knowledge of astrology and music. Then I'd like to finally focus on a brief explanation of a work attributed to him that I'm currently working on with the help of Pablo Benito and Maria Dolores Rodriguez from the University of Granada. The title of this work it's a small manuscript, it's a brief manuscript, it's called Al-Awasim Qawat al-Qawasim, which we have translated as the Citadels that protect from adversity. This work comes from a manuscript found in the National Library of Egypt. It's a short work comprising 5.5 pages, which are divided into short subsections. The first thing that stands out in this manuscript is the word that leads the title, Al-Awasim. This word can be literally translated as capital, as the main city in a region or a country, and it gets a metaphorical meaning in the field of spirituality. Indeed, for Ibn Sab'in, the citadels are a protection against adversities, as the title itself reads. In the preface to the work, he also describes them like salvation practices, munjiyat. This metaphor of the citadels of the soul reminds us of the workstations of the hearts, maqamat al-qulub, by Nuri of Baghdad, the 9th century Sufi mystic, a contemporary of another great mystics like Junayd and Mansur al-Hallaj. In this work, the heart of the believer is described as a circle of 7 castles, each corresponding to a certain spiritual virtue, where knowledge of God is at the center and Satan lies outside, trying to gain access by seducing the believer to abandon his practices and virtues. This work is considered the origin of the very extended metaphor that reached even Christian mystics centuries later with Santa Teresa of Avila. So, how are these citadels brought together according to Ibn Sab'in? He explains this in the preface as follows. Virtues, fada'il, which allow to distinguish destructive from salvation practices, the citadels, are contained in the different sections of the work, which are called fusul. After this, he explains the content of the sections, the fusul, in 3 levels, with each explanation denying the previous one. First of all, he says that the purposes, the effects, and the principles, the causes, resemble the branches of a tree and its roots. He then retracts and explains that they are rather key ideas where the purposes are implicit in the principles, and where in turn principles are kept in the purposes. At the same time, he's relating these principles or causes with the operational properties of the Quranic verses, khasa'is al-ayat. Thus, he introduces the Islamic worldview of creation as a sacred book and the Quran as a compendium of creation. Despite this explanation, he retracts again to ensure that, we quote, "It is in fact the light of God, the holder and the friend, and his grace, which he grants to those that he wants in a better way, and his wisdom, which he gracefully gives to the one who is perfect from his servants, giving him greater perfection." It is convenient to clarify at least 2 consequences of this third explanation of the content of the work, which closes the prologue. On the one hand, Ibn Sab'in is claiming divine inspiration for this work. The attribute with which God is named is the friend, al-mutawalli, a word that comes from the root waw lam ya, the same root for the word walaya, which describes the spiritual state of proximity to God. On the other hand, the archetype of the perfect human being, al-insan al-kamil, represented by the Prophet Muhammad, lies in the word perfect, kamil, which he uses also. After this prologue, the sections start. They are 12 in all. Each one begins with the word fasl, which also means season of the year. It seems that Ibn Sab'in addresses in each of them a certain virtue, generally mentioned in the first sentence. For this reason, and given the doctrinal content of the work, each section could be understood as a certain station or stopping place that the aspirant to the mystic union must visit along their training. In this sense, these stations would be very close to the concept of spiritual station or maqam, which is also mentioned in one of the sections of the work. So finally, since we are still in the process of studying the work, we will just discuss one of the sections, the third one, which is particularly interesting because of the writing style used by Ibn Sab'in. It's very short and it reads as follows. There is no salvation, nor pure worship, nor good manners, or correction of worship, nor merit of knowledge, or practical way, for he who has not been enclosed by sciences, nor trimmed by Gnostic knowledge. So, what's interesting about this section is the fact that the first members of each opposition, salvation, good manners, merit of knowledge, and sciences, ulum, and the second members, pure worship, correction of worship, practical way, tariqah, and Gnostic knowledge, ma'arif, create 2 levels of practice and knowledge, so this section becomes a source of meditation. We should also highlight the metaphor of the garden and the trim. The enclosed garden is for the worldly knowledge, al-ulum. We could match these fences of knowledge with the permitted and prohibited actions, the field of the halal and the haram. For this reason, it is necessary that the candidate is enclosed or adjusted by the sciences of religious law, al-ulum al-islamiyya, it is also necessary that the candidate is trimmed, adjusted also, by the Gnostic knowledge, al-Ma'arif. It's also worth noting that the metaphor that fence the garden and the trim comes at the end of the section, so all the virtues listed above would be fruits of this garden of knowledge. We could finally highlight the continuity of these metaphors of nature with the ones that appeared in the preface when describing the content of the work, the principles as roots and the purposes as branches, or with the word chosen to name the sections of the work, which is fasl, season. And so, like this, we finish the brief comments on absolute existence in this region and on Ibn Sab'in, and thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks.